Now, this evening, as part of the Bridges for Peace series, we have Mr. Jakob von Uexkuell, who will talk about the initiative for the World Future Council and its goal of building moral leadership to overcome the culture of greed. The World Future Council aims to bring together the world's wise elders, thinkers, pioneers, and young leaders in a forum for debate leading to concrete action. And 24 commissions will work together on the main challenges facing humanity today, such as responsible entrepreneurship, protection of indigenous peoples and cultures, and sustainable urbanization. Mr. von Uexkuell, the chairman of the World Future Council, is better known as the founder and chairman of the London-based Right Livelihood Foundation. And these awards are often called the alternative Nobel Prizes. He was born in Sweden and graduated with a master's degree in politics, philosophy, and economics from Oxford University. He first worked as a writer and translator, and later was a member of European Parliament. In 1980, Mr. von Uexkuell sold his personal philatelic collection to provide the Right Livelihood Foundation with a US $1 million endowment. And these awards, each of which come with a US $230,000 prize, are given annually by the Swedish Parliament just prior to the Nobel ceremonies. These are given to outstanding individuals in fields of environmental protection, human rights, health, education, housing, and technology. And just within the past few years, there was a tie recipient of these awards, Professor Sulak. Now, please join me in welcoming Mr. Jakob von Uexkuell to discuss the initiative for the World Future Council.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the club for inviting me. Thank you to the International Peace Foundation for arranging this visit. I've had a number of talks at Chulalongkorn University. I was just up in Chiang Mai to discuss with various civil society organizations this new proposal, which is the first time it's being presented in this part of the world. I've always said I'm a possibilist, not an optimist or pessimist. I believe both can be disempowering. I'm a possibilist. I see that we are facing extremely serious challenges in the world, and I'm a generalist, not a specialist, but I think has certain advantages. I found in one conference I attended recently, one of these speakers gave a broad overview of the global situation. Afterwards, several specialists, quite prominent scientists, came to me and said, you know, we didn't realize things were so serious. I said, well, surely you knew that in your area. They said, yes, I knew it was pretty bad in my area, but I didn't realize it was so bad in all the other areas too. And so the question is what you do about this. I should just maybe sort of say a few things about my own background. I have worked in the European Parliament. I worked in business. The stamps I sold was actually my business. I decided to turn my hobby into my profession. It wasn't just a personal collection. In case you sort of suddenly think about your childhood collection at home and wonder whether it's worth $1 million, it probably isn't. And I'm also no financial wizard. If you wondered how a $1 million endowment could produce annual awards of 200,000, we have, after I funded it myself for about the first 5 years, we then started receiving donations. Interestingly, most of these donations come from women. Most of them are actually from Germany, some from Sweden, and really from a number of countries. I worked also on a couple of international commissions, the one drafting the Declaration of Human Duties and Responsibilities, which was prepared for UNESCO. I was on the board of Greenpeace Germany. So, you know, with that spectrum, I decided that we needed to honor the alternatives, look for the alternatives and make sure that they get a higher profile. Not because I claim to have the solutions, but because it was quite clear that the public debate was too narrow. And one example of that was the Nobel Prizes. I mean, you know, you can argue, as I did, that there should be Nobel Prizes if you introduce a new Nobel Prize for economics, you really have an obligation to introduce a few more new Nobel Prizes. If you have the custodian of the most prestigious international award in the world, and then in 100 years you introduce one new such award, not created by the founder, and that is for economics, then why not an award for the environment, for example? You could argue, why not one for architecture, for example? And when the Nobel Foundation said no thank you to that, I set up this award, which of course is much smaller in monetary terms. Dealing in stamps is not as profitable as inventing dynamite. But by working with Swedish parliamentarians for a number of years who were sympathetic, and getting this permission then to present the awards in the Swedish Parliament, we of course been able to raise the profile quite a lot. That was not easy. The first year when I presented it, there was a serious debate in the Swedish media whether it was a CIA or a KGB plot to discredit the Nobel Prizes. But after 5 years, we were invited to present it in Parliament. And what we found over the years was, of course, that not just were there areas where really you needed such awards because they give hope to the young, they show what is important in the world, and we found that the award became more than an environmental award. We're getting nominations in a number of other fields. We have honored architects, we've honored agricultural pioneers. You'll find on the website rightlivelihood.org, you'll find a history of the award recipients through the years. And as was said in the introduction, Professor Sulak Sivaraksa is the Thai recipient. There have been a number of recipients also from Malaysia, from Indonesia. In fact, it is not an award specifically for the South, for the so-called Third World, but it is not an award either, which is stuck in this Western cultural straitjacket that the only things worth awarding have been invented or discovered in Western or Northern universities over the past decades. So it has a much broader perspective. It's a very democratic award. As you know, for most, if not all, other prestigious international awards, only a small group of people can actually nominate and propose somebody. Well, we have a different system. Anybody can propose anybody except themselves or their own organization for this award. And so it's very interesting, the kind of feedback we get. We really get a very international and very varied selection of sort of nominations to choose from. And it became clear a few years ago that even in awards where there is an award like the Nobel Prize, even in areas where there is such an award, they are not really very up to date with what's important. They are not following the will of Alfred Nobel, who wanted to honor those who confer the greatest benefit upon mankind. So very much wanted to be socially relevant, wanted to be future relevant, not just scientifically brilliant. So we found that if you looked at the award for physics, there was not a single award recipient who was a pioneer in solar energy physics and the whole field of renewable energies, which is probably the most important for our future, most important research being done. So we gave our award 2 years ago to the Australian Professor Martin Green, who was the most successful solar photovoltaics researcher in the world. So that just as a background about the awards. I then found, after working with this now for many years, that it somehow wasn't enough. It wasn't sort of shifting the perspective enough. We needed a permanent body with people, not just obviously with our award recipients, but with, as I put it, wise elders, wise planetary elders, men and women from all over the world. I then had a preparatory meeting where one participant, who was actually a Pakistani, said, well, not just wise elders, pioneers and youth leaders, which I think is a very good combination. We need them to speak up for our common values as citizens, as world citizens, because at the moment only our very much narrow values as global consumers are actually being represented and spoken up for at the global level, daily, of course, by commercial speech through the media, but also by the institutions which our governments have become subservient to, which doesn't, of course, say that, we are not consumers. We are and have always been, and we always traded, but we are more than that. But people are increasingly feeling very frustrated because they find that only their narrow values as consumers are represented on the global level, and that's why there is so much resentment and protest and anger and distrust of this whole process, which has been called, globalization. But what I didn't want to do was to create just another non-governmental organization which produced nice documents and held a meeting now and then. There are enough of those, more than enough. So I said we want something ongoing. I'm not using the word permanent, of course, being in a Buddhist country. Nothing is permanent. But we wanted something also which bridged the implementation gap, which is now the major problem. If you look at what's going on in the world, you find that there is, even among the establishment, agreement that we need drastic changes. They come up with all sorts of goals, like the UN Millennium Goals. And then they look back after a few years and have to admit that, of course, they are nowhere close to reaching them. It was actually the World Bank president who said recently that if this process of implementing the Millennium Goals goes on as slowly as it has in the last 4 years, they are not going to be reached in the year 2015 as was planned, but in the year about the year 2150. So, you have this huge implementation gap. And I wondered how you could bridge this, and it came, and you may think this is very, very strange, how an organization like this could do it. But it's interesting that a number of prominent individuals, from His Holiness the Dalai Lama to Michael Gorbachev, have called for such an institution over the past 15 years, because they have felt this great need of an institution representing us as citizens, representing our culture. The Dalai Lama calls it a sort of global conscience, speaking up for human affairs from the perspective of ethics, as he says. Now, as a result of that, we've had a widespread endorsement from Nobel Peace Prize laureate Joseph Rotblat, from Prince Hassan of Jordan, the president of the Club of Rome, but also, interestingly enough, from corporate leaders, from prominent individuals and international organizations. We have had launching organizations from the business world, the Association for Environmental Management in Germany, BAUM, and also from the world of civil society, the network, Earth Action, which is in fact our US office, which you'll find on these leaflets, and a network of over 2,000 non-governmental organizations in about 180 countries. And as I mentioned, Sulak Sivaraksa is not only one of our Right Louder Award recipients, he is also has agreed to serve on the first board of the World Future Council, which I still call the World Future Council Initiative, because I'm determined that it will be the councillors themselves who will make it into a permanent body when the funding for the launching has been raised, which we're now working on them, and there is enough money to carry the initiative forward, to start the initiative. But I've insisted that this is an initiative which has the council itself has to be launched on a quite a different level. It has to have secured funding for several years, and on a level where it can do serious work. And this is because I don't think we need another NGO. We need a different process, and above all, it is because the kind of individuals you need to attract to such a body are going to wonder very seriously whether they can take their very busy time and move some of that into the World Future Council. And that is why we have insisted on having this initial secure funding. And what we have done is we have gone to various cities in the world and said, if you want to have the secretariat, host the secretariat of the council, you have to come up with that funding, not from taxpayers' money, I don't expect that, but from wealthy individuals in the city. I mean, this was, after all, the way basically the United Nations came to New York, because one New York financier, Bernard Baruch, and got together with a couple of friends, and they provided the funding to bring the UN to New York. And we found that there's been a lot of interest. At the moment, the city which is in the running in Europe, where of course I've been working mostly on this, is Hamburg. The mayor of Hamburg and an all-party coalition in Hamburg are working very, very hard to raise the funds to site the secretariat there and to launch the World Future Council. But it is quite clear that it also needs a home in Asia. We are planning these 24 different thematic commissions. This is a list which has come from a number of different sources, including if you look at a book called Global Issue Networks by the vice president one of the vice presidents of the World Bank, Jean-François Richard. He comes up also with a list of about these 20 subjects where he says we also need global reforms. And we think it's quite important to bring these under one heading, because one problem today is that there is so much specialization, and as a result of which you don't get anywhere. You have a problem, governments commission some expert commission to come up with a report, and so you get a report saying, yes, it's a real worry for the global environment that the Chinese are buying so many new cars. Another report says it's a real worry for the global economy that the Japanese are not buying so many new cars anymore.
One report, and this is this is totally true in Europe, says we need to lower the retirement age in order to reduce youth unemployment. Another report shortly afterwards says we need to raise the retirement age because otherwise we can't afford to pay for the pensions. And of course you have commissions worrying about the increase in private household debts, and you have others worrying about the fact that if people stop increasing private household debt, the whole growth machine will collapse. So it's very important that we have these various themes looked at under one umbrella, but at the same time we don't intend to build some huge international organization with 24 international commissions. We're looking for homes for credible institutions to house these various thematic commissions, and of course I would welcome one of these homes, and maybe this a secretariat, also part of the secretariat, to be in Asia. And I think Thailand has many advantages, not only from a geographic or point of view, from the standpoint of organizational facilities here, but also because it's got such a vibrant civil society. Now, clearly, the present global order is not working. It has no future. It's quite clear that when you project scenarios like global warming and others in even 20, 30 years into the future, more and more people are realizing that we're heading into a very disastrous future. And those who claim that is not so and publish books like this Danish statistician a couple of years ago, they very soon get found out to be extremely shallow. I mean, what we are finding, and what I find very worrying, is that we are now finding that among the climate researchers, for example, there's a very small minority saying it's not really human-made and it's not really so serious as you think. Much bigger minority saying it's much more serious than the majority thinks. It's not a question of decades. It could happen within years. I mean, there have been reports now from Austria to Alaska to Tuvalu that the effects of global warming are becoming visible much faster than the mainstream had expected. I also think that even before that, we are facing we are being threatened with, I don't think we can say it we're facing it, but social, cultural, and maybe also economic collapse of our societies. I don't want to sound unduly pessimistic, but if you work with a sort of a general overview, it is quite shocking to see how these various issues are coming together. I mean, the drug issue is now increasingly an issue of, I find also of legal drugs. The fact that drugs like Ritalin are given to children in Europe from the age of 6, in the USA from the age of 2, with a rapidly increasing tendency, and that the answers we are getting for this are increasingly disjointed and short term. That we seem to become sort of prisoners of an ideology of selfish greed and economic growth being not just one aspect of our lives, which is justifiable in emergencies, but the solution to all our problems, when in fact it is actually the main problem. And that's easy to say, but we need a debate on how to counter that. People can have widespread agreement on some sort of ideal state they'd like to live in, but when you say, well, how do you get from here to there, we haven't actually engaged in a serious debate on this. One of the latest proposals which have now come out of the discussion in Europe is for a sort of global Marshall Plan to help the poor and then create sort of ecological and social market economy. But there is no clear strategy for that, how to get it, how to get there. And I think that has been one of the main problem of the reformers so far. They are very much agreed on, not just on what they are against. Even there's some agreement about the goal, although quite understandably, the goals are very diverse, because part of the main, one of the main claims is that we want much greater diversity, but there's no agreement or no clarity about the strategy. And I think what is the problem? The main problem is that this one idea of growth and greed being the way forward is not just there sort of as part of the debate. It's being promoted by our regulations, international regulations, by institutions, by the daily onslaught of consumers' propaganda. And there is nobody, actually, there's no strong voice who speaks up against this and challenges this. And we don't really need, I think, a new ethics, to invent some new ethics. I mean, where would it come from? We are very complex human beings, and what we need to do is to ask questions as citizens of ourselves, not just questions as consumers, and then you get quite different answers. We need an ongoing institution which speaks for these deeper, broader values and also helps educate people in these values, not claiming to speak for other people, but speaking for other values. We have written to 8,500 non-governmental organizations in over 200 countries in the last couple of months, asking for proposals for names for the World Future Council, because we, the group who's working on this, we don't know who is a respected individual, a youth leader in Mongolia or Argentina, but there are obviously organizations there who know. We are in the next few months going to be approaching 15,000 democratically elected members of parliament all over the world with the same question: who do you admire, who do you trust? Because we intend to bring these parliamentarians into the structure. The idea is that the proposals which the World Future Council comes up with will immediately flow into a parliamentary network being created by an initiative we are working closely with called the e-Parliament Initiative, which has the aim to link electronically, obviously in the first instance and mainly, all the world's about 25,000 democratically elected national members of parliament, so that the proposals can then flow through them directly into national parliaments, accompanied by civil society campaigns whenever necessary, like the campaign which was organized to get the landmines, the legislation to ban the landmines. So I'll conclude just by reading from the summary of the initiative, just to give you some more ideas why this is an idea whose time has come. Our greatest challenge today is not the global crisis, the various global crises, but our failure to respond to them. To repair the outer state of the world, we need to heal our inner state, weakened by the daily brainwashing aiming to reduce us from citizens to just consumers. There is widespread global agreement on key values and action priorities. International commissions have shown that individuals from very diverse backgrounds can agree, when challenged to think for the common good, on agendas for earth justice, democracy and sustainability. So why the glaring implementation gap, implementation deficit? Because the ruling ideology treats greed not as a character fault, but as natural and universal. Our problem is not human nature, but which part of our nature is glorified and backed by the rules, information streams, and institutions of power. At a time when our responsibilities are more far-reaching than ever, our criteria for action have become increasingly short-term. While ancient societies gave veto power to councils or seers into the future, which existed in many ancient Asian societies, we give veto power to current economic conventions. If our ancestors had been so short-sighted, we would be long extinct. There is now a growing global revolt against this betrayal of our deepest values. And I mentioned some of the examples about how that is being expressed. We therefore need institutions with the ethical and intellectual authority to guide us through this most difficult journey which humanity has ever undertaken to a world of earth democracy, justice and respect for life. And the World Future Council is sort of aimed to help to guide that journey, because this unprecedented transformation of our societies cannot well be guided by institutions which were created for very different purposes and are subservient to an ideology which sees sufficiency and reduced consumption by the rich as a threat instead of as an opportunity. I mean, the Japanese example, I think, is very glaring there. And it was in fact Thomas Jefferson who once said that the most important and the most difficult issue and challenge for every generation is to create the right institutions. So this is, what we are now trying to do, and I thank you for your interest.
Thank you very much for your comments. Now we'd like to open the floor to questions. We have a microphone at the back of the room there that you can use. If you have questions, please state your name and your organization. Okay. All right, I'll take the first question. You had mentioned that some of the UN organizations are having difficulty with implementing their policies. How do you see the initiative that you would like to form? How will you be able to do a better job with actually implementing the policies and getting them to actually bear fruit?
Well, without being sort of, overtly cynical. I mean, the truth is that the UN is an organization of governments, and these governments are representing us as increasingly just as consumers, but not as citizens. And I think there are very many initiatives in the UN which one can work with, but if you try to do something like that inside the UN structures, you pretty soon find yourself being blocked. And people have tried, as you know, people from various walks of life and with high prestige have tried to come up with UN reform proposals for very many years. And I tried with an international initiative which was chaired by William Ury, the Harvard conflict negotiator, who has also been active here and author of the international bestseller Getting to Yes. We tried a very simple thing, just to do a practical experiment on how to reform, if you can reform the United Nations system. We picked up the fact that there is a UN organization, namely the Trusteeship Council, which, as you know, has no function anymore because the trusteeship territories have all been released into some kind of independence. So we said, why don't reform this and call it the Trusteeship Council for the Global Commons, being responsible for the oceans, the air. That would not even demand a UN Charter revision. This is very sort of simple reform, and we found it got absolutely nowhere. You couldn't actually even get a vote on it. You couldn't get it through because there was such a fear of any proposal like this, which might possibly alienate US Congress and therefore get them to cut the funding again. And these high UN officials said, and UN ambassadors and their assistants said, well, this is sort of our livelihoods which are at stake here. Have you checked this with the US Senate before you come here? I mean, this was the reality of trying to even come up with some very moderate suggestion how to pick up a defunct UN organization and give it life again. So after that, I decided that it is not very helpful to try to work this inside the UN, but that doesn't mean that we are not working with the UN. I mean, the chief of strategic planning of UNESCO was one of the representatives at the first meeting of the World Future Council Initiative, and I'm still in touch with him, and he welcomed what we are doing.
Okay. Yes, your question, please.
My name is Sunandan. I run a small publishing house and a journal devoted to global understanding. What we do is that we basically run issues on nations. I mean, each nation is sort of a focus of a particular issue, and we have people from that nation write about their own problems and prospects and whatever. I really enjoyed your comments. Many of your thoughts have possibly crossed some of our minds over the years. But a few questions. One, that, I think that the name World Future Council is kind of a very interesting name, because possibly it's time we moved away from the European idea of nation and looked at other ways of defining the world. And I think that, I've been part of a few dialogue programs in Eastern Europe and South Asia. And I think that, inter-civilizational dialogues is possibly a better way of defining the dialogue structures today. But there is another more fundamental issue. I mean, we heard here a few weeks ago Anita Roddick, who was also brought here by International Peace Foundation. And it's all well and good for Europeans, enlightened Europeans, to think that, the world is not going very well, and, the Bush administration or this and that are doing awful things. But the problem happens here that the oppositional voices that are opposing the world system are also coming principally from the north, in the sense that these oppositional voices are, I would say, monopolizing opposition even. So there has to be possibly a mechanism which your council, this World Future Council that you were talking of, needs to take into account that people like Sulak Sivaraksha here in Thailand, or Muhammad Yunus in Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, or someone in India or in Africa or in Argentina, has the overall global audience, even in terms of the oppositional voice. And I think you cited that UN came to New York because of these private wealthy individuals giving money. I think if Europe does not move away from the fact that even if you do your headquarters in Hamburg, you will still geographically be Eurocentric. And that geographic Eurocentrism really limits in many ways the overall functioning of such things, including the Nobel Prize. I mean, or you give alternative Nobel. I mean, the fact is that European societies function in one way and other southern societies really look at it, Sulak Sivaraksha, I mean, I don't mean anything to Sulak Sivaraksha in person, but would be very proud to say, I have been awarded Right Livelihood Award by so-and-so in the North. So there is the whole issue of creating institutions, as you said, of Thomas Jefferson, mentioning Thomas Jefferson. Institutions have to be created somehow in the global South that are representative of the whole globe and not only of global South or global North.
Well, I couldn't agree more with a lot of what you say, and I mean the problem is you have to tell your, the Southern friends and Southern leaders that. I mean, I was quite shocked just a few weeks ago when I got the latest magazine, the latest publication, the South Center, which is supposed to be sort of speaking the voice of the South, and there aren't very many of those, and then finding that 2/3 of the contributors were Northerners. And I mean, I think it's probably quite interesting to have some left-leaning American professor comment about what goes on in President Bush's mind. But, I don't need to read the publication of the South Center for that. I mean, there are lots of other publications where you can read, Noam Chomsky and others. I really feel that it is a mistake that, the voices of the South are too often also, defer to Northerners. I mean, I've been involved many years in, creating an award which is not part of this straitjacket which has been given to Southerners. Now, would it be better if that award was presented somewhere in the South? I don't think so. I think that in the reality, the challenge which we give to the Nobel Prizes by presenting it in Stockholm has helped to open doors in the South. I mean, that is the reality. There's many Southern elites, as we know, are basically agents of the North. Their thinking is more Northern than that of many Northerners, many ordinary Northerners. And when they suddenly see that somebody has received an award from the North, they take that person, the South, more seriously. I mean, that's the reality we have to work with. And I mean, I wish, that was different. But I mean, when the South has an opportunity to go its own way, like during the economic crisis here some years ago, when there was a proposal for an Asian monetary fund, and, the U.S. said, we don't like that idea, and immediately it was dropped. So this is a problem for the South. We are finding increasingly that Southern civil society leaders are getting very disillusioned about coming to meetings in the North because they can see that they're not really changing the system and that they need to spend more and more time helping and defending their own people. I mean, one of the aspects that I'm sure you have noticed, and especially in a country like India, is when all the political leaders are basically doing the same thing, when they don't dare to promote real alternatives anymore. The only way they can distinguish themselves is to start promoting communal hatred. And so we know that, we now have this increase in communal hatred in areas where that hasn't been for decades. And I mean, that's nothing specific to India. I mean, we had that in the Balkans, a few years ago. But so, my friends there who have been working on this many years say, we can't really afford the time now to leave, to come to Europe for yet another meeting. So we are aware of that, and we are aware of the need to hold, more of these meetings and encounters in the South. But of course, there are problems there with setting up such an organization in the South. There are, I don't think that most mayors in the South would get so engaged and interested. I mean, we found that we've been working in Europe because that has been where there has been a response. I would very much welcome a more active role there from the South. And I think if you look as representatives of the media about the global situation, something very, very curious happened between 2002 in Johannesburg, when almost all the leaders of southern countries were endorsing the Northern agenda in their contributions, to Cancun, when suddenly the majority of these southern leaders joined with the civil society representatives in saying no to the Northern agenda, saying more and more free trade, etc., is the way forward. Now, what happened in those 18 months? I'm not quite sure, but it's quite clear that there is now a challenge. There is now a new alliance. Maybe the southern leaders were finding that so little was on offer, that the North was so arrogant and offering them so little that they didn't dare to come back to their own peoples with it anymore because they thought they might be overthrown or whatever. But there was an opposition in saying no. There is not yet an opposition in saying, there was a joint saying no. There's not yet a joint yes. It's very difficult to know what they are actually for, and part of that is that they have no forum to debate these issues. And so the idea of the World Future Council and the various commissions will be to promote and present such a forum where you pick up so much which has gone on. They take just the Earth Charter, a very interesting and good document. Lots of people, north and south, spent years going around and consulting from the grassroots to heads of state to produce this document. And I said to Stephen Rockefeller, who was one of the initiators, I said, what's the goal for this document? He said, well, the goal is to get it voted on in Johannesburg, get it adopted as some kind of non-binding soft law document, but at least, then it would have some sort of status and it could be used in education worldwide. And even that was blocked, of course, primarily by the United States. And so then people say, well, I've wasted all my time on this. Now, what do I do next? And I say, well, unless you create some kind of institutions to stand up for these values, then you're always going to be at a disadvantage, because you are going to have your little commission, and after a few years, at most, if you have the funding, you're going to produce a report, which is very interesting and which ends up on a bookshelf. And I was, a couple of years ago, I was at the 20th anniversary of the Brandt Report on North-South relations. And, there was a widespread agreement there that you could write most of this today because none of it has actually been happening. There's also, a very interesting beginning of this kind of debate, which we're talking about, where I found myself at the final session press conference seated between Mrs. Brundtland, who was then head of the World Health Organization, and Meda Patkar, who was one of our award recipients, who was fighting against the largest dam project in the world, the Narmada Dam in India. And you had the Mrs. Brundtland pleading for more aid, saying, we absolutely need more aid to the poor. And Meda Patkar said, we don't want your aid. All your aid is doing is building dams. Stop it. And I had to sort of try to find some, middle way there, because of course, I think it's important. There are cases where aid is highly desired. At the same time, most so-called aid which is given at the moment is really destructive.
Okay, is there another question? Yes, Mira.
I wondered why Kun Sulak Sivarak, first question, why Kun Sulak Sivarak, other than anybody else from this country, for this Kingdom of Thailand? That's first question. Second question is, why he's not here with you tonight? The third question, does he know where you are tonight? Fourth question, why not Kun Thaksin, who mentions of grassroots? I am a Korean, so I have two questions on behalf of my fatherland. What is your Korean counterpart of Kun Sulak of Thailand? And about the Nobel Prize, I thought that Kim Dae-jung was supposed to receive it together with Kim Jong-il. Was it? Thank you.
Why Sulak? Because he is not just seen by many as the father of civil society in Thailand, having set up very many organizations here. He is also very much internationally known and respected for his work on engaged Buddhism, socially engaged Buddhism, on alternatives to consumerism, has inspired and set up various meetings. He knows about this meeting tonight, but I know that he has some important house guests at the moment. I've saw him yesterday and the day before, and I'm sure he would be available to speak about this at any time you would like to interview him. Who is our partner in Korea? Well, I mean, the World Future Council initiative, it's too early to say that we have a partner organization in Korea, but as you probably know, the Right Livelihood Awards last year went to a Korean organization, to the CCEJ, to the Citizens Coalition for Economic Justice, and Reverend So, gave a very forceful presentation of their work in Stockholm. It is a remarkable organization which has worked to democratize economic development in South Korea, to also help setting up committees to work for reconciliation and information about the North, who work to protect immigrant workers, etc. I'm going to go there later this year to speak in Seoul, and hopefully then also be able to present the World Future Council initiative there.
When will you be in Seoul this year?
It's not yet fixed, probably in November.
November. I met Kun Sulak this evening. It was a National Day celebration. Greece. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, another question?
Yesterday at Chulalongkorn, you addressed that we're in prison. Could you say something more about that? Also, with your award, is it only like the Nobel limited to living recipients, or can it be posthumously awarded? The third thing, how can we nominate Noam Chomsky?
Okay, so for those of you who may not have been able to hear that, he'd like to have more comments on the concept of being imprisoned, whether living recipients are only eligible for the award, and how to nominate someone. Noam Chomsky.
Starting from the end, to nominate, you can just do it informally. Just contact the foundation. You will find more information about that on the rightlivelihood.org website. You can write to info@rightlivelihood.se. SE is the code for Sweden. And I can give you the address, the card later on. Anybody can nominate anybody, as I said. You will then get a questionnaire asking you for more information. And we welcome nominations. I'm trying to think, because several people have been talking about nominating Noam Chomsky, but I'm not sure it's actually been done yet. So this may be the time. No, we decided some years ago not to have a posthumous awards, and I think that the jury and the board will still stay with that. Yes, I did say yesterday that we seem to be imprisoned by this ideology of consumerism and greed, because it reminds me of what happened in Moscow when I was a member of the European Parliament in sort of 1989, and I would go there and talk to high-level Soviet officials and say things like, no, you as a communist, and they say, now wait a minute, I didn't say I was a communist, I was a member of the Communist Party. And I find increasingly the same situation, that even people who are supposed to be, running this, the present show, don't really believe in it. They find that this is, of course, some of them are very voluntary prisoners because it gives them power and money. But as soon as they retire, they suddenly start talking like anti-globalization activists, including, even the former head of the IMF. But for most people, it really is a feeling of, we have more money now, but we're not happier. All the life quality indicators seem to be going down, but people don't see a way out. And, I get educated grown-ups coming to me and saying, but if I consume less, won't the economy collapse? And it's therefore very important to show ways out of this prison. And of course we have created a society which cannot just be reversed tomorrow. Just give you one sort of practical example. I know in Sweden the government's saying, well, the younger generation needs to learn to sort of look after its grandparents again. We can't let the state do everything. But of course we have for 50 years we have built apartments which are for nuclear families. You can't suddenly have an extended family in most apartments in Sweden. And there are many, many aspects like that where we need a transition time, and you can take it in the field of energy. It's another one. It's very easy to sort of say we can do all these renewables, but how long is it going to take to implement that strategy, and how much time do we have? I spoke once at this future workshop which one of the big oil companies set up, and whenever you talked about what should happen in 40 years' time, everybody agreed, and they were all smiling and said, yes, of course we're in favor of that. I said, now wait a minute, I'd like to go backwards. Now if that's supposed to happen in 40 years' time, what needs to happen in 30, in 20, in 10 years' time? What needs to happen next year? And suddenly the whole thing was far too radical, and they didn't really want to talk about it anymore. And this is part of the prison we have ended up in. And I think it's therefore very important that it's urgent and high time that we have an ongoing body where these debates are being held, and where they don't just end up in some kind of document, but we then see where can we get not consensus. You don't need consensus in a democracy. You need majorities. Where can we get majority on? What aspects can we get majorities for now? And for example, an energy transition is one issue where the work has been done. It's basically all there. It's absolutely absurd to have a situation where we have an energy system based on extraction costs. It's ridiculous, because if you compare renewables to non-renewables, they're opposite. The sun shining yesterday, that energy is lost forever. You can never recoup the renewable energy of yesterday. With non-renewables, it's the other way around. It's the one you used yesterday, which is gone forever. So therefore, to compare the two according to extraction costs and say solar energy is too expensive, it's just nonsense. We can create the necessary funds for a transition, for an energy transition tomorrow. It just needs an agreement by the IMF major shareholders to issue a special allocation or special drawing rights to fund this. We can do the same with all the major issues which we brought up in the Millennium Summit. Money is not the issue. That is ridiculous. Money, no bank says to us, if I come to a bank and says, I want money to speculate on options on options on options, no bank says, sorry, money is all gone. So to say we don't have money to do these things is nonsense. We have the knowledge, we have the technology, we have the workforce, and we have almost 1 billion unemployed in the world. Then we have the money, as the great economist John Maynard Keynes once said, whatever we as a community want to do, we can fund. So it's the will which is lacking, not the money.
Sam, did you have a question?
Thank you.
I'm unclear as to how the councils are supposed to work. And are they just going to make suggestions, or are you planning to turn this into government entities? How are you going to implement whatever policies you come up with? And I say that apropos, Jefferson has been mentioned as a model for organization. And of course his idea was that, well, human nature is such that we need to set up a three-part government, each which can watch the corruption of the other part. And not idealistic at all. Adam Smith, when he created capitalism, said that greed is going to be the productive force in this type of society, because greed in any other kind of society that has existed destroyed it. And greed is there, and so what we're going to do is create a society where greed becomes a productive force rather than destructive. How are you going to get around that? And I guess third, you talk about you're going to get people who have reputations. Well, reputation is a status hierarchy, which is a power realm, which is no different from economic power or political power. And this is something that people will strive for and be greedy about like anything else.
Well, I'm sure some people will very much want to have the reputation which will get them chosen to join the World Future Council. And once we have the initial council, which will be set up, based on these proposals which come in from 15,000 parliamentarians and 8,500 NGOs, I mean, you can't really do a broader selection process than that unless you set up some kind of global elections, which obviously is not realistic. But I'm sure if people want to, more people want to be wise so that they can be, chosen for the World Future Council, I think that would only be for the good. I think the thing about the council, it's not going to have some political power. It's not going to be a governmental organization. It's going to have moral power, and that power is going to be reflected in the quality of its work. It's not something which it will just get automatically. But I think today people do trust individuals. They don't trust institutions. I mean, in Germany, there was an opinion poll a couple of years ago where young people didn't trust any institution. Some years previously, they still trusted Greenpeace and Amnesty. Now there was no institution which the majority trusted. But when His Holiness the Dalai Lama comes to Germany with a very simple message, but a message where words and deeds seem to coexist, you can't get a hall big enough in Berlin to host this meeting. They had to get this sort of open-air auditorium where normally they have rock concerts, and I thought that was it's interesting. So he is obviously one of these people who, people trust. But there are others on a different level. I mean, you don't just need to have a council of the Dalai Lama, Mikhail Gorbachev, and Nelson Mandela. You know, there are others in every country, and with a bit of discussion, one can find them and identify them. And how would it work? Well, the first step is, as I said, identifying these individuals, which we're working on now. Simultaneously, we're doing a World Future Report, just a sort of executive summary on these various issues where we need global reform, saying where are we at and where are we heading to and where could we be headed to if we did our best, and what are the practical steps going that direction. And so the various thematic commissions then will have something to start with to help work out the practical proposals which the Council, when it meets in plenary session once or twice a year, will debate and adopt by majority vote or by consensus, pass over to its parliamentary members, brought into the e-parliament network, voted on there. So you would then have the pretty strong moral force of this council of wise elders and pioneers and youth leaders endorsing something, and having it endorsed by majority vote of an organization linking all the world's democratically elected parliamentarians. And with that, it then goes into the national parliaments. The members, the MPs, take it into the national parliament. And if you then still need to mobilize to get it adopted as model legislation, as an international agreement, then that can be done through international NGO networks like Earth Action, who already have been doing this successfully for over 10 years, setting up sort of system of action alerts and working with at least 2,000 member NGOs, but in other cases with mailings up to 10,000 NGOs. So this is the process which we envisage, and it's quite clear that there is no such process at the moment. There is no process from debate to implementation. There is debate, and then there are other pressures totally somewhere else, and there are some international agreements being passed on. They are not being coordinated in any way, and this is an attempt then from a civil society perspective to get such a process going. And I'm pretty sure, I'm convinced that once this process has been going, it won't take many years until also it is realized that this is an indispensable part of global governance, and the necessary funding and resources would come once you get it going. But the problem at the moment is that there is a need for this, and there's a lot of enthusiasm, even interestingly enough from the business sector. Although if you see my papers on it on our website, they're pretty critical of the present world order. But I'm personally amazed at how many people still say, yes, this is what we need. But at the same time, there's a fear of big ideas. Will this actually happen? And therefore, we just need to get it going. This first step, I think, is the most difficult, and that's what we are working on. And we've had some funding. And if you sort of wonder, who funds this? Well, actually, these are the three major donors so far. In the region, $100,000 plus have been all people from business. One of them is a woman who is in the field of health products. Another is a former Coca-Cola executive, and the third one is a man who was in the field of energy. Very conventional. Now, regarding Adam Smith, well, he certainly said that greed can help, or selfishness can help, but within ethical limits. I mean, he was very clear about that, and that's always being ignored when people talk about Adam Smith. That he was very scathing about what businessmen and traders would do if left to themselves, that they would then really defraud the society. I mean, those were the terms he used, and therefore we needed a very strict ethical limits within which people could be allowed to be selfish. And I agree completely. I think competitiveness is very useful within a framework. The problem is when the framework suddenly becomes the competitiveness. It's a problem, the difference between the market economy, which have produced societies of unrivaled wealth, and now the attempt to set up market societies, which are basically self-destructive and imploding.
I'd like to know more details about your funding. You mentioned you're currently in the process of obtaining the funds needed to establish the council. Where are you right now, and how much farther do you need to go?
Well, very, very practically, we have the funding we have received enable us to continue with the initiative. the council, I've said, and one can argue with this figure. I mean, these international commissions of the past had annual budgets of about $5 million, Brundtland Commission, etc., and they functioned only for 3 years. And we need something ongoing. But I'm convinced that after 3 years we will get major institutional funding. So I've looked at this again these first 3 years, and I've said, well, if at least the absolute minimum is a third of that. We've told these cities who've been working with and the regional governments that we want a firm commitment of at least $5 million for them to host the secretariat there. I mean, a very, very small amount, by looking at what we're trying to do, but also reflected in the fact that it's very, as I said, difficult at the moment to convince people about, big ideas. And we could very well easily, tomorrow get that or get double that. It could also take a year or more. I don't know what the fundraising dinners will bring, which the mayor of Hamburg is now organizing for next month and the month after. And in a way, we can't really, because word gets around, we can't really sort of work in several cities simultaneously. We have to give each city a chance. We worked with one city who decided that they were not really big enough for it. And Hamburg is now the second city we've been working with in Europe. And it doesn't stop anybody starting to work in creating some other cities to host the commissions or to host the center, the secretariat, working in other languages. I mean, we are actually working we are discussing this, whether it makes sense to host the Spanish-speaking secretariat also in Europe, or rather on the island of Tenerife, where the governor of Tenerife has been extremely supportive and has offered free facilities in many ways, but we haven't yet got the secured funding to actually start operating in Spanish. So what are the kind of donations we have received? Well, as I said, a couple of donations of 100,000, one of 200,000, which enable us now to start employing staff and take the initiative one step further. And the council will be launched with a major international event as soon as we have the 5 million. I think it's as simple as that. And we are still open to looking at other cities. I mean, there is a proposal, and I sympathize with one of the questioners before about is everything happening in the north, everything happening in Europe. That if you do counter the ruling consensus, you should start in the south. And I have absolutely no problem with starting in Asia or Latin America or Africa if that interest suddenly materializes.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Yes, I'd just simply like to ask what your thoughts are of the Chicago School, because they seem to have displaced Keynes. The most popular figure is Friedman in the Chicago School of Economics, what they call out of the University of Chicago. And what are your thoughts about these multi-conglomerates that are the largest part of this globalization program that's going on today? Do you see these conglomerates as a real danger to the world?
Yes, I think the Chicago School has taken over. I was interested to see that this man who tried to sort of attack the environmental movement, claiming that there was no real environmental threat, this Danish statistician, Mr. Lundberg, has now trying to get together a group coming up with global priorities for development. And this group when you look at the list of these professors, I think the first 3 of them are from the University of Chicago, so you more or less sort of can know already what the result is going to be. And I understand the attraction of economic freedom, for many countries in Eastern Europe, etc. And so it was very understandable how attractive these ideas got. And it took them a while to realize that they were actually in a situation where they were destroying their communities. And, they were promoting a sort of freedom, small freedoms at the expense of the larger freedoms. Because suddenly there was no alternative anymore. And I think this is a big subject, but it's increasingly becoming apparent. I think the Thatcherism in the UK was a very sort of clear example of people at the end of it saying, yes, we are richer financially, but the social and human and cultural and environmental cost has been huge, and most people feel it's been too big, that your quality of life and the security of life has gone down, and you can find the same situation in many countries in the south. I mean, there was a very interesting debate between Vandana Shiva, one of our award recipients from India and grassroots activist there, and the former Social Democratic Danish Prime Minister at a conference in Brussels a few months ago, organized by all the Social Democratic parties, again arguing whether globalization is actually benefiting the poor but not benefiting them as much as the rich, or whether it's actually harming the poor. And Rasmussen saying, the Danish Prime Minister, ex-Prime Minister saying, but surely there's all these statistics coming out, saying that the poor are also somewhat benefiting. And Vandana Shiva saying, you got the wrong indicators. They are benefiting on paper because you included them into the market economy, but you're forgetting all the non-market wealth which they have lost in that process. And there is a lot in that way, but that's another big subject. We can discuss the various economic crises here and how they've affected different parts of the population. The more integrated you get in the global market, the more vulnerable you are at the same time. I think the problem with the transnational corporations is they actually contribute very little to providing global employment, etc., and they are demanding very much. And one of the most interesting developments in recent couple of years has been the split in the business sector. You can no longer say, well, this is a view of business, because the World Economic Forum, where the global players meet, found that to their cost when their economic dependency, the European Economic Forum, which met in Salzburg for a couple of years, and they invited the Association of Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises to join them, and this association, the Wirtschaftsbund, said, which is not a radical group, it's actually very closely linked to the Austrian Conservative Party. They said, no, thank you. You're not our allies, you are actually our enemies, trying through various international agreements to restrict our ability to label our products as local, as healthy, as free of GMOs, BSEs, whatever. And so they actually wanted to join the counter summit, the social summit. And the social summit, there were of course some leftist groups that said, good heavens, we don't want business here, and so they ended up having their own summit. But this is, I think, a very interesting development, because you are having a situation where these corporate-led globalization is also destroying markets. I mean, these huge corporations are not interested in functioning markets, competitive markets. If they see a competitor, they either ruin them or they buy them up. And of course, they are really planned economies. They are not, free market enterprises as we understand it. And they're planned economies who don't even pretend to be planned in the interest of the whole population, like the planned socialist economists did. They are quite clear about that. They are planned in the interest of their shareholders. And one American critic of this system, David Korten, former professor at the Harvard Business School, long-term president of the Ford Foundation in Asia, based in Manila, and then retired and wrote two very powerful books. And the first one is called When Corporations Rule the World. And in it he says that the 52 largest planned economies in the world today are private multinational corporations. Number 53 is Cuba.
Yes, another question? I think this will be our last question
I was
of the
just
evening.
a little interested in the issues and the substance as opposed to the process. And you mentioned there were 24 issue networks. I thought that was perhaps a lot for people to really relate to. And I've heard you mention, I think, global warming and energy and consumerism. Could you say what are the top 5 issues, and is urbanization one of them? That's an area I'm interested in. Thank you.
Yes, I mean, the issues are certainly, it's very difficult not to lump too much together in one commission. I mean, do you talk, because people are experts on different things, those who are experts on nuclear disarmament are not necessarily experts on conventional disarmament, what you do with the whole issue of the right to water, the right to food, you lump it all together. We have looked at obviously the environment, you look at social justice, the right to education, etc., and we came up with this list of 24, but you could try, and I think it makes sense to try to restrict them to 12, but then they would be very big commissions. And it's interesting you mentioned urbanization, because we had one we had the commission on energy, and we had one actually on intelligent building, which I think is very important. And then the man who we're working with, one man we're working with very closely, who's a member of the initiative, his name is Herbert Girardet, who is a British-German filmmaker for the BBC, but also an expert on sustainable cities, and in fact written 3 books on sustainable cities, which you may know. He was just recently, he was the thinker in residence in Adelaide in Australia, advising them how to turn sustainable. And he came and said, you can't subsume sustainable cities with intelligent building. It needs its own commission. So, it's quite hard then to, on the one hand, you want to try to not have too many. At the same time, it's quite clear that, when people have a very specific area of expertise, it doesn't make much sense to lump too many of them together. So, maybe we have to find some way of grading them. But certainly, one of the first, hopefully, commissions which will take shape is the one on sustainable cities, simply because of the personal energy and the contacts of Mr. Girardet, who's now working full-time on this, and in fact is the editor of the World Future Report, which I just mentioned.
Okay, one last question.
Yes, I'm just kind of curious. Has anybody ever written anything about comparing the old companies from the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, like the East India companies from the Dutch, the British, and a few others, in comparison with multinationals today?
Well, I'm sure they have. I mean, I can't sort of offhand come up with a book, but I mean, it was the interesting thing, if you look at corporate history, is how their rights expanded, but how they first, corporate charters, which gave this limited responsibility, were only really given to charities first, and then corporations began to get them, but still they were pretty limited. And it's very modern development where they have unlimited rights, but really fewer and fewer responsibilities. I mean, this whole idea of limited company responsibility is a very modern invention. Then the idea that they suddenly should have the right to free speech, they should be treated like persons, is another pretty modern invention based on a couple of U.S. Supreme Court decisions. And in some ways, of course, these corporations, ancient corporations, had huge powers, but I mean, they also had huge responsibilities. I mean, they were basically in charge, as you know, of huge tracts of land. And I mean, the problem today with these big corporations is that they want all these rights, but when you talk about their responsibilities, they say, no, we don't want that. We are just here for commercial reasons. The responsibilities belong to governments, but they have, at the same time, they are taking away the resources which these governments need to fulfill their responsibilities. So there is a very sort of great conflict there between corporations who insist on being, rejecting the primacy of politics and wanting more power even than governments, but don't want the responsibilities which goes with that power, and then realize that, of course, they only really want to function because they're also led by human beings who want to live in safe environments, and they only really want to function in functioning communities. So they then find that they are destroying the basis for their own success. I mean, when people come to me and say, we have all this deregulation, I said, you don't have deregulation, you have re-regulation. You can't, no sensible corporate leader wants a deregularized, free-for-all society. They want a place where not just are they personally secure, but where there's laws of contract which can be implemented. Otherwise, they wouldn't invest there. I mean, the only really totally free capitalism we had recently in the north was probably Albania in the mid-1990s, and that wasn't a very attractive environment for corporations.
Okay. Thank you very much for joining us this evening and giving us your ideas on the World Future Council Initiative. We appreciate your time with us.
Thank you. Thank you.